everybody, and welcome to your episode of the Full Crew on electric vehicles. We're going to be talking about everything important in terms of electric vehicles, from regulation to their actual implementation infrastructure. We've got some great guests to talk about these topics today. I'm going to go from right to clockwise around the circle here. So in the top left, we got Chris Treanor. Chris, tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're here.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Glad to be with you today. My Gump in Washington on policy. I'm actually a lobbyist, which is okay. My mom knows already, so no problem there. I focus on climate change and have since the beginning of my career working for the Energy and Commerce Committee. Relevant to today's conversation, and under Joan Dingle, of course. Thank you for having me.
Great to have you on. Next up, who's traveling right now, so we don't have the benefit of making eye contact, but we do have his amazing voice to share on these topics, and that is Chris. Or no, I'm sorry, Matt Bianco.
No problem. So thanks, Mike. Yeah, sorry again. I'm on travel. I'm in the home stretch of the last week of the federal fiscal year, and that's what I do work with, is with the federal government and the procurement of EV charging stations and infrastructure to charge the vehicles. So my history is I've done about 20 plus years of federal work. I was in software, and then I moved into cybersecurity until about 2015, and I came aboard a company called ChargePoint. They're the market leader in EV charging. And so I was there until 2019, and then I created my own company, FedWay Consulting. So with FedWay, I have partnerships with ChargePoint, Beam Global, which is a self-contained solar charging station that's portable, that I work with the military and others on, and things like that. So I also have a partnership with a service-disabled veteran-owned small business by the name of Apollo SunGuard. They have a blanket purchase agreement with the government to procure these stations. So it's pretty easy. They've made it really easy, and we'll get into the details around that when I talk, but it's been an exciting almost decade-year run of helping agencies get implementations of EVSE. So excited for this conversation.
Well, we thank you for that hard work, and we look forward to your insights. And we also, last but not least, have Joan Michelson. And Joan, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thanks so much. I'm delighted to be back on Full Crew. I'm Joan Michelson. I have a podcast myself called Electric Ladies Podcast with 450 plus episodes on innovation in the energy, sustainability, climate, and automotive space. I worked at Chrysler in EVs, so I'm a bit of a disciple on the topic. I cover it a lot on my show. I write for Forbes, and I do consulting and coaching in this space, including with people who are trying to elevate their careers in the industry. And I'm delighted to be here, especially with two very cool co-experts.
Well, aside from having one of the best podcast names ever, you're also, I think, one of the few people who've made it onto the Full Crew a second time. So congratulations for those honors. And you're also the first article today. So we're going to take a look at that. And what do you got here for us?
So thank you for the privilege of being one of your few repeat guests. I don't have too many repeat guests on my show either. So, and the shout out about the name. Thank you. The article is called "What a Kamala Harris Presidency Could Mean for Electric Vehicles." It's a story actually from ABC News. And this is really the topic du jour, right? I mean, we're in the middle of a presidential election. People have already started voting. There are many, many issues, but this, it's going to go. And I appreciate, and Chris are here because the infrastructure is a critical piece, and how the government interfaces with private sector is a critical piece. I say the train has left the station. I mean, people say, yes, it's slowed a bit of EV sales, but we sold 1.5 million EVs were sold last year. It just wasn't as big of an increase in sales as the previous year. And frankly, these guys will attest the infrastructure is still being built, but the Inflation Reduction Act is really pushing forward with $7 billion on to fund 500,000 charging stations, and that's really the key hub. Um, and so I think that there's really kind of no argument about which candidate would be better for electric vehicles. And frankly, the infrastructure, there's I think 70, 80,000 new infrastructure projects with the Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act now. Trump has come out anti-EVs, even though he gets billions of dollars from Tesla, who he says is a great guy, but he still is kind of anti-EVs. He doesn't think they're going to last, which is kind of funny. So I think that the argument for EVs with economic growth is really strong. But I'm curious to see what my fellow panelists say with the. And one other quick thing is people have talked about, as well as range anxiety and the charging issue, they talked about price. The average price of an EV is about 53K, 53, 54K. But if you apply the tax credit in that's now available, it brings it down to almost exactly the same as the average price for a gas-powered vehicle, which is about 48, 49. So I think if you're into EVs and you want to support Detroit, Mary Barr was just on CBS this week talking about their General Motors continued commitment to EVs. I've had a few of her executives on my show, so you could listen to those. But I'd love to hear what my fellow panelists have to say, what their reaction is to this article as well.
Sure. Maybe Matt wants to go first.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So just, in working for ChargePoint for those years and seeing not just from the consumer side, but from the fleet side, and seeing the growth on the fleet side too. And just to take a step back, where I work mostly is with the Executive Order 14057, which is part of it is to electrify the federal fleet over a certain number of years, 100% by 2027 of new purchases and things. So seeing the trepidation from the agencies too, and as you mentioned, Joan, the cost and the worries of that, and then helping them and showing them the benefits of having no maintenance on these vehicles and the cost of ownership over time. I take pride in actually flipping some pretty hardcore military guys into hating EVs and thinking, wait, these things are great. I don't have to worry about the maintenance and my fleet drivers and getting them into to get oil changes and things like that, which is all the stuff that you lose. So I agree with you. I feel these questions from friends, from family, from all kinds of people asking, hey, people aren't buying EVs. Well, they are. Again, it maybe just is at a little bit slower rate than we anticipated, because of course you get that bump of early adopters, then you get that next phase where they have to kind of dip their toe into it, and maybe they get it as a second car, or they'll use it for their around town. Maybe they even get a plug-in hybrid, which I'm not a big believer in, but hey, if it dips your toe into the waters to learn how to plug in a vehicle, I mean, at least we're going in the right direction with that. But yeah, the Infrastructure Reduction Act has been great. I'm starting to see all these, I don't get involved in the NEVI program, but with NEVI and seeing some of these states, California just made an announcement, I think it was today, of they're going to start divvying up their money. So I mean, there's just so many mechanisms in place, and I see the momentum. I think it's there. I think it'll stay there.
Yeah, it's funny.
I want to hear from Chris, but can I just respond to Matt
Yeah, sure.
real quickly? I agree. By the way, you might want to listen to my episode with Akin. You may know her. She's head of the federal program, reducing the energy use of the entire federal government, 650 buildings and vehicles.
Yes.
Also, when I was at Chrysler, we sold thousands and thousands and thousands of cars to the government and to the military in particular. So I hear you on that totally.
That's great. Anna's great. Yeah, I go to Energy Exchange every year. They have it in a different kind of Rust Belt city every year, which is cool. Is in Pittsburgh, and she stopped by my booth with the administrator, Robin Carnahan, and of GSA, and we had a nice conversation. That was the first time I met her in person, so I'll have to go back and listen to that. Thank you.
Yeah,
So-
and I'm happy to jump in here too, because Joan, I actually almost picked this same article, and the question, what does a Kamala Harris administration mean for electric vehicles? My answer is everything. It is. We're at such an inflection point in the development of the market, of consumer preference, and the industries, your former company and all of Detroit and the U.S. companies and those around the world are trying to figure out where the consumer demand is on this and how to make sure that they're fitting into to this nascent marketplace. And so it's such a fragile time. You would hate to see it disrupted. And obviously, I think a Harris administration would double down on the effort of Biden administration to continue the implementation of IRA in a way that works for the industry, that advantages particularly U.S. automakers and the manufacturing of the vehicles domestically here in the United States. The issue of critical minerals and components will continue to be a massive issue, and I think there's trust that a Harris administration would be able to walk the tightrope between making sure that supply chains are robust and able to continue, and also ensuring the U.S. Remains a leader in the space. And I don't want to ruin my article of China, but it's hard to not talk about China. But the question that I get from clients these days is what's going to happen to the IRA in a Trump administration. I think we know a Harris administration would be, I don't want to say a continuation of Biden, because I think she'll bring her own ideas and she'll bring her own team, and there'll be a lot of energy brought to this, new energy brought to it. But in a Trump administration, there are many ways, even if it's not unified Republican control of government, that the administration, through executive orders, through rolling back things that the administration has done, that they can disrupt the progress that's being made on EVs, whether it's defining what a free trade agreement is for the critical minerals, determining what is the domestic content, how you measure that. There are so many devils within the details of these things that you really do want to have leadership making these decisions that's informed and shares the priority of deploying EVs as quickly as possible to deal with the climate crisis and promote U.S. domestic manufacturing and the jobs that go along with it.
Sure. Yeah, I get that question a lot too. But I would point out that the states love this money, including the red states. I mean, 75% or so of the money from the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure bill went to so-called red states. I did some stories about these issues too in Forbes, but the key for me is that I think there were a couple of dozen Republican lawmakers sent a letter, you would know this better than I, Chris, to Speaker Johnson saying, don't hands off my IRA money, basically, because like Georgia has become like the EV capital of the country all of a sudden. It's very strange.
Yeah.
And so, I think your point about treaties and stuff being rolled back is really good. But there were just I think it was 7 billion allocated for critical minerals too. So anyway, we'll see. Fingers crossed.
It will certainly. I agree with your initial assessment. The train has left the station. So, and Speaker Johnson even said in a recent press conference that he would bring a scalpel as opposed to a sledgehammer to the IRA, which is a huge signal as far as I'm concerned, because the power of Trump and sort of his instinct to roll back anything that has defined his predecessor will be a strong one. And so resistance from the House Republicans will be really important as they try to defend those massive investments. There's already steel and concrete and steel and cement in the ground down there, to your point, Joan. This is not a bell that can be unrung in those congressional districts.
Yeah. in terms of how impactful the administrations can be, just look at a historical record of decision makings around green energy, etc. I think Trump has a historical record that you can look to assume where his stance would be on this, even if you weren't saying current, election statements, because people in general make promises one way or the other. But even on both of those fronts, I think he's speaking to the pulpit, how he would probably roll back a lot of these things. And as far as like the Elon equation, I mean, politics make strange bedfellows, right? I think that's more to do with Elon's interpersonal relationship in politics, or with politicians on the left side of the aisle, than it has anything to do with each of those individuals' stances on green energy or electric vehicles. That's something to chew on. Anybody have some comments to that?
Yeah,
it has to do with money. That's for sure.
That's why he opened up the superchargers to to GM and Ford and things like that. He wanted to have more access to the money. So
and then he fired the team.
Perfect example. True.
Yeah. So Elon used to be predictable, at least on some level, but even within the companies that are successful that he still owns, he's increased the level of unpredictability on what, honestly, I try not to make judgments on technical stuff, because you assume there are great engineers at any of these companies, right? I mean, there are paychecks to go with their engineering skill. But yeah, a lot of them have been stupid the last 3 years. So, and I think we could just look at the record at this point for that. That's not like trying to pass judgment on it. Like there's been a rollback on like this. Also, Tesla quality has gone down, or was actually never, or was always too variable because they were making constant changes, which is very different than we've seen in other technological or in motor vehicles in general in the past. There was an assumption that you could use a software model on a hardware device, and then even on a mechanical device that hasn't borne out the same way that I was expected by the not only Elon, but the people who invested in him for electric vehicles.
I have a question. Oh, go ahead.
I just want to make one point that a lot of people don't know, and that is that Tesla was on the brink of closing and bankruptcy, and was saved by $200 million from the federal government under the Recovery Act by President Obama. So for him to say, "Oh, we'll cut this off," is a bit disingenuous. I think it's really probably just trying to keep money from his competitors. But it actually can help him. That money helps him too, because he gets more chargers, which means more, increases the market for EVs writ large and makes it bigger. So I just want to remind people that Elon Musk is speaking, he's got a little selective memory happening here when he talks about someone.
Well, actually, almost all of his businesses and any of Thiel's businesses, which they learned at PayPal, if you get the government support, socialism for them is okay. So, but but like, honestly, you do want tax dollars to go to incentivizing innovation. I think the problem, though, is when the winner is picked before the contest begins, that you have to be cautious about that, right? So we've been cutting Matt off here. So what did you have to say?
No, I have a question, because I'm going through it right now. Actually, I've been just went on a test drive with my brother yesterday to the Tesla dealership here in Austin. I'm in Austin visiting. I live in DC, obviously with the federal work, but and we're talking about the tax credit, and he's trying to make a decision, and we're kind of going back and forth, and I'm helping him out, and he doesn't want to pull the trigger quick, but it's the end of the quarter, money, quarter revenue, all that stuff. So obviously they have great kind of deals right now, but I'm curious about the tax credit, because I see it in your article, Joan, as one of the last kind of bullets. How do you and Chris, because you're much more of an expert on this side of things than I am, but how do we feel about that? Do you think that's going to be something that could get cut off pretty quickly if Trump does win, or do you think there's a chance that continues? Or I don't know a whole lot about I'm kind of curious your thoughts.
Well, I'll take a stab at that first and let Chris chime in. First of all, I interviewed Rachel McCleary, who is a top person at Treasury. You guys may know her. She's one of the people who helped design the tax credits. So you might want to listen to her. She talks a lot in our interview about tax credits for electric vehicles.
Okay.
And what I understand
Former Bengal
is
staffer. Sorry.
oh yeah, oh that's right. I forgot. That's right. Yeah. So yeah, you can give a shout out to your friend. Um, but one of the things that she points out is, well, first of all, people love the tax credits. Everybody loves, when you can save $7,500 on a car, I mean, like, why not, right? But the other is there's rules. You can't just eliminate a tax credit. You have to, it takes Congress, it takes a lot of things, and there has to be it's a process. And also the industry is pushing back because these are creating thousands and thousands of jobs, especially in states that tend to vote red more than blue. So why would, I mean, he'd be shooting himself in the foot, and his colleagues are not going to vote for it because they'll lose their seats. They'll not, and in the House it's every 2 years, right? So they would lose at in cycle. But also, what are they going to do? Close a plant in Georgia because I mean, like, no, I just don't really see it. I think there'll be a lot of bloviating and a lot of bravado and lip service. But I don't think it's really going to happen because there's too much on the other side. There's too many people who like it and too many benefits to the states that that love this money.
So real quick, Chris, because then we want to get to your article. So
sure, yeah. Well, it's probably a good transition because the that $7,500 consumer tax credit is that's a China competition tax credit as far as I'm concerned, and that's the way I would pitch it to the Trump administration, who of course are focused on China in such an extensive way. I do think on the spectrum of the most vulnerable to least vulnerable IRA tax credit in the Trump administration, the $500 consumer tax credit is probably the most vulnerable. It's the one that President Biden, it most defines his administration and his presidency. I think he's tied himself to the success of EVs very closely. And to my earlier point about sort of motivations of Donald Trump and his policymaking, I think that will be relevant to that. And then, of course, consumer credits like this are sort of just not something that Republicans have traditionally supported from sort of their, fundamental approach to government. So I do think it's the most vulnerable, but I also think the only way that's actually vulnerable is if there's a full clean sweep. Republicans win the House, they win the Senate and the presidency, which I think is unlikely.
Makes sense.
All right. So let's bring China into the equation. See what happens now. All right. So tell us a little bit about China's global EV dominating just beginning. I thought they had already dominated and were actually dealing with almost what do you call that? A siege. Yeah. So their exports are exceeding demand, right? So tell us a little bit about what's going on.
Yeah. The headline, China's global EV dominance, and we're just beginning to respond. That's probably a more accurate description. China's been out for a while, but our policymakers in Washington are responding, in a way that we've never seen before, or at least not in my lifetime, because there's, I don't want to be too hyperbolic, but it's a Cold War, footing towards China. It is not just in the EV space. Of course, it's, all of it is a national security focus as well as a global competition focus. And so there's strong economic concerns from policymakers in Washington about China's subsidies and the way that they may be dominating the global supply chain for, not just the full vehicles, but components throughout these cars. And also, the national security implications. I can't really speak to all of the concerns that have been expressed in yesterday's Commerce Department announcement, but certainly relevant. I picked this article, maybe a week or so ago, and just yesterday, the Commerce Department Secretary Raimondo announced that they were again proposing a rule to ban Chinese components from connected cars. So hardware, software, sensors, things that can be used to send information back to China or Russia. Russia was added in this version. And so it's a clear signal from the administration that this is a priority. They originally proposed this idea back in February. There was some, comments filed publicly from automakers around the world in the U.S. that there would be some concern and struggle with the supply chain to replace these components. And nonetheless, 6 months later, the administration is coming back and saying, this is really necessary from a national security perspective. So let's take another opportunity to hear from industry, weigh in and collect public comments, but this is coming. And so help us figure out from the Biden administration perspective, how best to implement something. The issue, of course, crosses outside of EVs into chip making and other areas that we've seen, the clean energy, solar panels, batteries, of course, for storage, all sorts of different things. And so this is something that DC is well aware of. We're, working closely with Europeans, which is the focus of this article that I sent. And then something else that Joan mentioned, which I think is really, really important to this and not something that can be solved in the immediate future, is the fact that the average EV in the U.S. is, say, $53,000. The average non-EV in the U.S. is $48,000. BYD delivering, an electric 5-door vehicle for $9,500. I mean, that is so disruptive to the potential marketplace. I mean, forget technology, forget anything. The price point alone is just, incredibly concerning for anybody trying to compete at that level. That's a car that's sold inside of China. It's not imported or exported to Europe or to the United States yet. But I think it is something that we need to pay close attention to, because prices are and political support for harsh approaches towards China, may fade if the iPhone is just that much cheaper and better than the next product.
Well, a tariff is a tax on the consumer,
Yeah.
right? And I think I've seen some, let's say, populist backlash to the concept of tariffs, as tariffs have become noticeable in daily life, right? So everybody likes a tariff when you're giving the other guy until you realize, oh, you're footing the bill for that, and the government and these corporations actually benefit from that, not you. So, Joan, what's your perspective on China's dominance? I saw you react to the price point. So
yeah. Couple things. I remember when Tata came out with an EV 20 years ago that was in that price range, and everybody thought it was made with bubblegum and rubber bands. When I worked at Chrysler, I was in Global Electric Motor Cars, which is low-speed vehicles, but they're on a car chassis and a car frame, and some of those go for about that price, but they're legal on streets as long as they're 35 miles an hour streets and below. So there might be an opportunity for at least GEM to compete there, and it's no longer owned by, it was Chrysler sold it to Paris when Chrysler blew up, but now it's owned by another company of some guys that used to work there. In fact, they reached out to me about it. But what I'm curious about too, from you guys, is the impact of Warren Buffett pulling out most of his investment in BYD. BYD is driving that, as you point out, especially with that price point. I realize it's just in China, but anybody in the US who hears of that is going to go, well, how come we can't have that, kind of thing, right? So I'm curious what you think is the impact of, because Warren, the Oracle of Omaha speaks, and for him to cut his investment by 20%, I think it was like from 25% to 5% or something. It's a big statement, and he doesn't sell stuff very often.
Yeah.
So I'm curious what impact you think that might have.
I'll take that one, actually. Warren Buffett said not to invest in TSMC because concerns about the geopolitical situation. So I don't. If you're going to take Buffett as a sage, I think I would caution you that he doesn't necessarily understand technology, and most of his money based on technology came from Apple. And he's
And
good at big
Microsoft.
long-term bets and secure things that are already secure. Wouldn't necessarily go to him for edge cases for what innovation is going to yield. In fact, I think Buffett is indicative of a good investment strategy because of that. If you want to take risks on innovation, you can, but most innovation loses out. But yeah, that's kind of the street will look at that, but also his influence on the street has to be waning, given that he hasn't hit a lot of the bigger, newer things that were on the market in the last 10 to 15 years. Also, he sold his Apple stock, so let's see what that means.
Yeah, I think it all reflects, what I guess a few years ago we called de-risking, but I think we can now call it decoupling fairly.
Yeah,
and you're seeing it right in the auto industry. And you probably can speak to this better than I can, but we're seeing business models basically where you have a global, company, and then you have something inside China that operates, and never the two shall meet. Whether that is sustainable or something that will be satisfactory from a national security standpoint for U.S. policymakers moving forward is a really interesting point that I don't know the answer to.
So yeah, let me put this as a question. So even taking out the geopolitical or technology security issues, I think everybody saw during COVID there's supply chain risks by investing only in literally just Eastern, by the cultural demarcation companies, period. Because if you can't get the goods here when we're in an emergency, then you haven't exactly build your risk portfolio intelligently. And that you've seen this in a lot of, it's not just China, America. Every country is evaluating its partners on this level now, including states that are not necessarily on one side of the China-Russia divide, China-Russia to America divide, such as Brazil or African countries. Or even the Gulf states. They're evaluating as intermediaries which partner is going to be better if stuff goes to crap. So just kind of an interesting dynamic when it comes to things. If we do become reliant on electric vehicles from China and something stops the possible import of them, then we have a real issue, right? In terms of transportation, mobility, and the logistics of getting important goods around the country. So thoughts on that dynamic?
I think that's a really good point. And that goes to, again, back to the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure bill. I mean, the CHIPS Act was right? I mean, even TSMC is building chip manufacturing plants in the US now. And Intel got $8 billion to build a range of plants in 4 different states, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So that's addressing that supply chain for everything, but especially for chips, because that's what slowed down the auto sector, especially, and that's what slowed down the whole tech sector. And of course, our whole world now runs on technology. I mean, look at what we're talking on today. Low, right? And that's why I get kind of frustrated with these people who say, we have to stop electrifying. It's like, fine, you want to go back to reading by candlelight? You want to not have your computer? You want to not have your cell phone? Explain this to me.
Also, we're on the cusp of such a level of efficiency. If we're just looking at, all right, so we might be reaching a mileage maximum that we could get out of lithium ion, but there's no hardcore evidence that we've actually reached that limit. 2, we're getting to a point with how far you could actually go with this thing that you're that worried. And if there is a technological advancement, then the entire argument for combustion engine vehicles kind of becomes moot, right? If you could get an electric vehicle that could go 500 miles without a recharge, that's just a better car now. So I can't tell if Matt is raising his hand or itching in his seat. So I want to hear from him. So what are your thoughts so far in the conversation on
No, I
on China?
appreciate that, and I hate that I'm not on camera because I love doing these things with the interaction. So, but I'm trying to actively listen. But I think from my perspective, in my world, it's a non-starter. National Defense Authorization Act, does not allow for any Chinese telecom. You get into but I do experience that with the charging stations, and charging station companies are starting to become, we see the stocks, we see where things are going. We see companies like FreeWire and companies like Tritium and things, companies that are having troubles to survive in this world. And how do we stay, made in America and have plants in America and all that. Now we can get around some of that. The federal government buys off the Trade Agreements Act typically. So it's Buy American Act rather than Buy America. I'm doing quotes here because when you drop that N for Buy America, it's a big difference. You get into the, where the steel is sourced and really down into the granular areas. But from a vehicle perspective, those will never touch that federal fleet. And I do think that from a fleet perspective, let's take away the consumer. I think they take a lot of their direction from the federal government. So these states and municipalities, all these big fleets, U.S. Postal Service fleet, all of these groups, are gonna be looking at more American-made vehicles, and things like that, or at least buying from their American plants. So the NDAA really kind of shuts that down in my world. So I don't feel that pain, but it's interesting to hear this perspective. And then again, I just parlay it into with the EV infrastructure and the charging stations. We've got to stay away from any Chinese-born pieces there, and that's my biggest fear because I do come from cybersecurity. So from 2009 to 2015, that was my world. I've worked for a few different companies, and that does concern me a bit. When we start to rely on that, and now I have this network of infrastructure. If we have a bunch of Chinese vehicles, it's another entry point. We already have our phones, and we have all these other vulnerabilities. So that's the perspective I look at it from.
Yeah, addressing it now, it can avoid that Huawei rip and replace, that we had.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Matt, I have a question for you though. Do you find in your discussions with them, by the way, you might want to listen to my interview this week with Tabitha Stein of Nucor Steel on their recycled steel. So it might be kind of interesting because you mentioned steel. But do you find that your clients in the federal government are raising the issues like, well, how come China's cars are so much cheaper, or how do we avoid dealing with China when they seem to have such a prominent space in the industry? I mean, what do they raise China as an issue in this regard at all?
It's funny you ask, because as you're talking through this, I'm trying to think, and just so you know, I work with everyone from DHS, to all the components of DHS to Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, all the way over to the other side where you get into civilian agencies like Treasury and USDA even, and things like that. So I mean, I deal with every agency, and I don't hear a lot. I don't hear a lot about that. I think they just probably know that that's a non-starter for them from a purchasing perspective, but I really don't. There are concerns about the cost, of course, because they do have to pay. I don't know a lot about this, but there is an additional fee when an agency purchases or leases from GSA a vehicle that's electric vehicle, or they call them zero emission vehicles because the plug-in hybrids do count toward those numbers. They have to pay something like $100 a month per vehicle as an additional fee. So there's lots of complaints around that. Yeah, I can't dig into the details of that. That's something that I hear from my customers. I probably shouldn't name the customers that have said that, but it's sort of a barrier to them. So cost of the vehicles is, but with that coming down and having all these options on GSA schedule for them to purchase, I work really closely with the GSA Office of Fleet, and I talk to that team on a regular basis, and even they don't really bring it up. I think they just realize, hey, it's not even an option, and there's a lot of differences to it. So surprisingly, I don't hear that very often from a federal fleet perspective.
Sounds like those people who don't like the $100 credit need Chris to lobby for them.
I agree. I can make some introductions.
We had that in Virginia. I don't know if we still do, where they needed, they were claiming to redo the Highway Trust Fund, but I don't think that's where the money ended up.
Well, I live off the toll road in Virginia and in Reston, and I know when they started the toll road, it was, it's just private. We're going to get our money back, and we'll never charge a fee again. No, it just keeps going up.
Yep.
By the way, I'm in Alexandria, Virginia, so I'm your neighbor. So go ahead.
Oh, there we go.
So just going to take a quick break to thank Clarity Consulting, UAS Strategic Airspace Link, Grand Sky, and True Weather for making this episode possible, and their continued support on all of the full crew shows. Actually, let's get moving on to the federal side of things. This is almost like a perfectly encompassed episode. You all picked great articles to talk about. So, Matt, we got yours up here. EV charging ports for federal buildings and GSA lease facilities. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about charging ports, because that's been like an up and down road in terms of infrastructure. So tell us what this article is about.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's an article, but it's also on GSA's website, so it's sort of a press release of sorts as well. But I think framing up, and I know, I'm kind of looking at the clock too. We're moving along pretty good, but slow me down if you need to, or I should say speed me up. But there's a lot behind this, so I want to make sure I can kind of capture it all. So the federal government, to procure their charging stations, have a few different ways they do that. I'm working with a company I mentioned, Apollo SunGuard. They're an SDV OSB. They're on their third blanket purchase agreement dating back to 2014 for procurement of charging stations, the hardware, the software, and all of that stuff. So there's a BPA for the actual charging stations and ancillary items. Then there's an IDIQ. The IDIQ, indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contract, is with a bunch of companies that range across 4 different zones. If you Google the GSA EVSE IDIQ, it comes up. But there's that's the construction side. So that's what gets kind of lost. There's a lot of work in all of this that we're talking about to put this infrastructure in place. So you either have to, look at the different levels of charging and what you need. We can get into a rabbit hole, so I won't do this, but we all know about the challenges around, do we need fast charging, or with fleet level 2 is really mostly sufficient. So there's a lot of education with the government around that. So when we talk about the ports, the important thing is getting the right infrastructure in place and not wasting money and putting in fast charging when you don't need it. I had an agency, I hate to say at one point, when they were early on, they put in a fast charger thinking they could charge their plug-in hybrids. And as we know, most plug-in hybrids are just the J1772 level 2. So there's a lot of education that's going on around this. So that blanket purchase agreement and IDIQ basically bring in the full turnkey solution. So it's the products to charge the stations, but it's also the construction work. And so this article, to go to that, is just a drop in the bucket. So GSA has, over 1,000 leased facilities across the country. And the challenge is, okay, we're going to spend this money to put in infrastructure. We don't have the money as an agency. GSA, we need your help. We're leasing, you're leasing this vehicle to FAA or something like that. We need help from a funding perspective, because that's the biggest challenge right now. Can we get this money allocated through the allocated budget to do these things? And I hear that nonstop. Hey, you have Executive Order 14057. We have to electrify our fleet, but you're not giving us money to put in the infrastructure to charge the stations. So it's a huge problem in the government. Every agency I talk to has that problem. So I danced around a little bit, but to come back to the kind of main point here is that 25 million is dedicated to these agencies putting in those stations. You can see the list of projects. It ranges from, you see a lot in Maryland and Pennsylvania and West Virginia and things to start, but it's spreading. I worked on a couple of projects recently in California. It's funny because What's different for me is it doesn't matter the state. DHS does a lot of work in Georgia. You mentioned Georgia, so there's the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. They've got probably about 60 or 70 level 2 stations, 30 fast chargers, and they've got about 25 of those EV ARC, the self-contained solar products that I deal with. So it's basically a mini microgrid. It's got the solar down to a battery storage, and then it outputs to this charging station. It's the finding the money, and I think this is a great example of at least they're trying to get some money based on those federal, those federal buildings. But then, also encompassed into that money is they're having, and this is near and dear to my heart, and not to drone on about it, but cybersecurity. So they are requiring these agency or these companies to be FedRAMP authorized. So there's 2 companies right now that are FedRAMP authorized, ChargePoint and a company called Chargy. There's a few more coming down the pipe, but it's a lot of money and a lot of investment to get FedRAMP authorized and be sure that federal, kind of box is checked, that our data is going to be safe. So that's part of that process, and getting that money allocated to your agency. You have to require those FedRAMP policies. So it's I went away from the article a little bit, but that's just a drop in the bucket. Certain agencies, a good example, and this may not be general knowledge, but for instance, DHS, they had $32 million to electrify, to buy EVs, put in infrastructure, do all that. With the latest budget that was passed, we were all excited it was passed. Well, they chopped that down to about $2 million that went toward their EVs. So I think going back to the Harris presidency, if we're able to get to that point, we can get all that budget money back into electrifying the largest fleet in the world, and getting infrastructure in place and having money to do that. And that's my biggest fear, is if we don't go that way, where will the money be for these agencies to continue along with that executive order? And will that executive order just get squashed like it did the last time?
In a lot of ways, it's a kind of classic federal problem, right? Having a mission, but no budget to make it get done, and trying to resolve the difference of that between people clawing on both sides, right?
Absolutely.
So who wants to go first?
I just want to remind everybody that it's not just a matter of somebody's mandate. We're talking about trying to save the planet. I mean, there's a point behind these net zero goals, et cetera. I mean, just look out your window. I mean, the droughts, the hurricanes, the tornadoes, the wildfires, the incredible floods. I mean, Europe is drowning, Pakistan is drowning. I mean, we've got islands in this world that are already being evacuated, and the whole population's moving. I mean, this is to address climate change and global warming. This is not just because somebody set an arbitrary goal. This is because the planet is facing, even Secretary Austin has called it a climate change and existential crisis. So I just want to keep reminding everybody that this is not just an executive order, that there's a point.
Well, it's interesting something you're saying there, because that would go under national security issues, right?
Exactly.
But it's interesting that one national security issue takes precedence over the other, right? Concern about foreign adversaries and data leakages. I mean, you can't let go of that as an important issue.
No.
But it seems to be the one that dominates over the actual existential crisis, right? So if there was a way to get
juggling these, absolutely.
Well, because in the drone industry, which I work in, like sometimes you have component parts where it really doesn't matter where they come from. They're not a brain. They can't hold the data or memory. They can't exfiltrate your data. So putting controls on them doesn't actually solve the issue. It actually just harms the progress of the entire industry to move forward. And if you really do want to find alternatives, sometimes not in the US is the answer. Also, there are other partners that you could help develop, but that's a much harder budget to get, right? To say I want to develop a near neighbor, like let's say Mexico or someplace in South America, who wants to push that money there at that risk of their administration changing, and now you've built a factory that won't export the cars for you, right? Anyway, throwing that out. But also, Chris, you haven't had your slug at Matt's comments yet.
Yeah, no, it is a great article because it really just demonstrates the opportunity for the federal government to lead and to be the tip of the spear. And I think the Biden administration, to their credit, recognized that very early on this. If we're going to be spending taxpayer money, it should be spending taxpayer money in a way that benefits the progress of the country and domesticates manufacturing and domesticates supply chains and all of the benefits that can go along with, the massive budget that the U.S. government has. It's separate from the GSA, but I spent some time trying to advocate for electrification of the USPS fleet when they, decided to rebid their next generation vehicles. And that is, there are hundreds of thousands of tons of future emissions, that can be avoided by electrifying those as quickly as possible. One commonality between USPS and many of the GSA facilities or vehicles that are used that Matt was referencing is predictability in their routes, predictability in how they're being used. And so range anxiety can be dismissed in those scenarios. Opportunities for charging is predictable along the routes and the ways in which they're going to be used. And most importantly, the upfront costs are not the primary decision point, because we're talking about taxpayer money being used over the life of the vehicles. And so it's a great opportunity for the entire operating cost to be factored in for electric vehicles. And the federal government can sort of show the way through the studies and through the usage in the early days of what those operating cost savings can be over the life of a vehicle.
Yeah, and just to tag on to that, like there's two thoughts I have from both of your comments is, the federal fleet it's very short distance, a lot of it. So, there's a very large military fleet that their average, use of those vehicles is 10 to 15 miles a day. So it actually ties to my other piece of the subject, which is energy resiliency and our fleet, and not having to rely on wonderful oil and gas and that whole world. We can kind of avoid that situation by bringing in microgrids, bringing in, battery storage, wind, solar, all of that good stuff. And Denver Federal Center is a really good example of doing a lot of stuff. The GSA administrator has visited there a couple of times. So if you Google and look up Denver Federal Center and what they're doing with the climate and microgrids and batteries and all kinds of cool stuff, it's kind of like their little hub of showing that off and being that leader that you mentioned, Chris. So I think that resiliency, so that's where the when you get into solar charging and now you're just charging, hey, that car's only going 10 or 15 miles. Oh, well, we need all this battery storage. No, you don't. You really only need, maybe you fit it in a spot, you have 30 or 40 kilowatt hours of battery, and you plug that car in every day. You do what's called daily range replenishment. You just, replenish that range for the day. You drove it 15, 20 miles. And I think there was some trepidation around that, but the government's realizing that, this isn't that difficult to do. And I was involved with USPS for a lot of years too, and helping them test the infrastructure for that. And it's just such a perfect use case. You're driving 20 miles a day on average or something like that, and it's easy. The range anxiety shouldn't be there. So there's some really big fleets. Now, one added little nugget is we are not just electrifying the GEMs and the little, low mileage vehicles. I'm working on a few projects with CBP related to pursuit vehicles. So they did an event down at DHS at St. Elizabeth's, their main campus, where they used a Ford Mustang, and they had because they have a pursuit package of the Ford Mustang, and they put in fast chargers, and they're using some of those at the borders currently. And we all know the fun discussion of the border that we could get into, but these are being used. At least they're electrifying those vehicles and kind of making an impact from that standpoint too. Then you get into buses at national parks. They're doing a lot of that. You're getting into heavy duty vehicles now, and then all the tactical vehicles for Army are new purchases are supposed to be electrified by 2050. That goal, we don't know what's going to happen there, but that's part of the executive order. So it's not just the little vehicles, but that's kind of the low-hanging fruit that they're hitting first. And they're doing a really good job with it. They're making a lot of progress.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you one more thing, Matt. So I had mentioned specifically components being okay coming from, let's say, even adversarial nations, but that's not the case when we're talking with federal stuff, correct?
Correct.
So like supply chain stuff really does matter there for security.
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah. So any type of chip or any type of telecom, that's all, there's a list of about 8 or 10 companies that basically China's off limits. And then they take it a step further where only trade agreements act countries are allowed for any components you use, whether that's the cabling or, the enclosure for the station or whatever it may be. They're very strict on that piece of it as well.
Because if diplomacy fails, just so the audience know, if diplomacy fails for any reason, hopefully not for the worst reason, but for any reason, then you can't get that part, and that could be essential to our infrastructure, right?
Correct. Right.
All right.
Right.
I just want to point out, it hasn't aired yet, but germane to this conversation, I interviewed Sherry Goodman, who you guys may have heard of. She's the first person to serve as Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security. And she just wrote a book called Threat Multiplier: Climate, Military Leadership, and Climate, Military, and Global Leadership, and Global, something like that, Global Security. And I'll probably air it around the election, but she's extraordinary. She goes into all these issues. It's a great book too, by the way, on climate as a national security issue, which she's been leading the charge on for like 25 years.
That's great. Well, I think that's a critical thing too, the resiliency, especially our military bases. We need to have those microgrids, and that's if there is an attack or there is something that happens, that we're not relying on the grid or on oil and gas or to power the buildings. Vehicle to grid is another thing that they've been talking a lot about in the federal government with such a big fleet. So anyway, Mike, sorry about that.
Oh, no problem. Got to close the show off. But also, just to kind of nail that point in, gas infrastructure is explosive. So it's actually an easier target for adversaries.
And it puts troops at risk when they're driving those trucks. They're sitting ducks.
Yeah, so although electric vehicles can have explosive moments, overall, they are the infrastructure that supports them, and the chances of them reaching that point of overheating is much lower. So anyway, we could probably dive into that. We could have dove into any of the articles today for the entirety of the show, especially with such expert guests as we had. I just want to thank our partners who sponsored the show: UAS Strategic, Grand Sky, Airspace Link, Clarity Consulting, and True Weather Solutions for their support. I want to thank Chris, Matt, and Joan again for participating. I want to thank the audience for tuning in. I want to remind everybody we got Mark 43 coming up on Dawn of Autonomy tomorrow. And everybody should tune into that if you haven't already seen Mark 43's product release. It was a great demo that they did with Dawn not too long ago. That's it for today. It looks like the future of electric vehicles won't be stopped by anything. So again, thank you to our guests for elucidating the nuances of this important technology as we see it move forward. That is it for today. We are out here.